Night in the Vietnamese countryside, late 1960s. A small team moves silently through a village, guided by moonlight and whispers. These are not regular soldiers engaged in open battle. They are operatives, some Vietnamese, some American, on a covert mission to find a hidden enemy. Their target is not a fortified bunker or an army unit, but a single shadowy figure among the villagers, a suspected Viet Cong cadre who by day poses as a farmer or shopkeeper and by night commands guerrilla fighters or intimidates local officials. Moments later, a short burst of muffled gunfire or the quick clatter of an ambush signals the culmination of the mission. By dawn, the team vanishes as quietly as it arrived, leaving behind a dead or captured insurgent organizer and the village awake in fear and confusion. This was the reality of the Phoenix program, one of the Vietnam War's most secretive and controversial initiatives. Officially begun in 1967 and reaching full force in 1968, the Phoenix program, known in Vietnamese as Viet Cong, the mythical all-seeing Phoenix, was a coordinated counterinsurgency effort designed to identify, target, and neutralize the clandestine infrastructure of the communist Viet Cong insurgency. The Phoenix, a creature that rises renewed from its ashes, perhaps was an apt metaphor. The program hoped to give new life to the pacification effort by eliminating the unseen threats undermining it. To many Vietnamese, Viet Cong, the name in their language, also evoked a vigilant, all-seeing bird of prey. At its core, Phoenix was not about traditional combat between opposing armies. It was about intelligence, infiltration, and ruthlessly selective violence wielded against an invisible network of communist agents operating within South Vietnam's villages and towns. The program brought together American and South Vietnamese military units, intelligence officers, national police, and even a handful of Australian special forces in a concerted campaign to tear out the Viet Cong's shadow government by its roots. To understand why such a program emerged, one must picture the situation in Vietnam in the mid-1960s. The United States had poured hundreds of thousands of troops into South Vietnam, engaging in fierce battles against the North Vietnamese Army and Viet Cong guerrilla fighters. Yet despite superior firepower and some battlefield victories, the U.S. and the South Vietnamese government struggled to secure control over the rural population. The reason was an enemy that moved among the people like a fish in water, the Viet Cong civilian infrastructure. This Viet Cong infrastructure, often called the VCI, was an elaborate underground network of communist operatives, informants, political officers, and local supporters that paralleled the official South Vietnamese government. In many villages, especially in contested or remote areas, the VCI functioned as an unseen authority. They collected taxes, spread propaganda, recruited local youths, and organized supplies and intelligence for the guerrillas. They also conducted terror campaigns, assassinating village chiefs or school teachers loyal to Saigon, kidnapping government officials, and intimidating families, anything to undermine the authority of the South Vietnamese state. By the mid-1960s, this underground network had swelled to tens of thousands of members and sympathizers, deeply embedded in communities across the South. Traditional military operations could clear an area of Viet Cong fighters temporarily, but once the soldiers moved on, the VCI would often re-emerge, reinstalling communist influence like a persistent vine growing back after being cut. American strategists came to realize that to pacify the countryside and secure any lasting victory, they needed to attack the insurgency at its core. It was not enough to win set-piece battles. The U.S. and South Vietnamese had to dismantle the Viet Cong's organization from within. This was fundamentally an intelligence problem, how to identify an enemy who was hidden among civilians and strike them surgically. The Vietnam War, from the American perspective, had become as much a political war as a military one. U.S. advisors liked to speak of winning the hearts and minds of the people. But winning hearts and minds also meant removing the fear that kept those hearts and minds under Viet Cong sway. Pacification efforts in the villages therefore developed two parallel tracks. One was the overt side, building schools, clinics, and local defense militias to protect people. The other was covert and more ominous, finding and eliminating the underground enemy infrastructure that threatened and terrorized those people. The Phoenix program arose as the sharp edge of that second track, the necessary blade to cut away the Viet Cong's influence where it hid. As early as 1964, the CIA in Vietnam had begun organizing small units to go after Viet Cong cadre in the shadows. These were South Vietnamese counter-terror teams trained and funded by the CIA, operating beyond the conventional battlefield. They would raid suspected safe houses at night, snatch local communist organizers, and gather intelligence through interrogation of prisoners. They had some successes, claiming high kill ratios of enemy operatives, but these efforts were fragmented and not yet unified under a central command. The turning point came in 1967. On May 9, 1967, all U.S. pacification efforts were folded into a single integrated structure called CORDS, Civil Operations and Revolutionary Development Support, which aimed to unify civilian and military efforts to win control over the countryside. Within this framework, the CIA helped develop a plan for a coordinated attack on the Viet Cong infrastructure. In June 1967, an Intelligence Coordination and Exploitation Program, ICEX, was launched to collate information on the VCI across agencies. By December 1967, the government of South Vietnam had established a program called Phen Hoang, after the mythic phoenix-like bird, to bring together the various South Vietnamese police, military, and intelligence entities fighting the covert communist network. In mid-1968, President Nguyen Van Thieu of South Vietnam formally signed off on the program, giving it full legal standing in his country. Around this time, the Tet Offensive erupted across South Vietnam in January 1968, a massive surprise wave of attacks by Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces on cities, towns, and military bases. Allied intelligence units pored over captured documents and prisoner interrogations from the Tet battles, uncovering valuable information about the Viet Cong's secret networks. Armed with this intelligence bonanza, Phoenix planners could map out the clandestine hierarchy of villages and regions and more systematically hunt down the key players. Although the U.S. and South Vietnamese militaries ultimately repelled the Tet Offensive and decimated the attacking Viet Cong units, the offensive starkly revealed the depth and coordination of the insurgents' local networks. Communist agents had positioned weapons and guided fighters inside supposedly secure cities. They had sympathizers in virtually every province. Tet was a shock to American and Saigon leaders, but it underscored precisely why something like the Phoenix program was deemed necessary. In the aftermath of Tet, U.S. and South Vietnamese officials doubled down on Phoenix, pushing it out nationwide with greater urgency. They hoped to prevent any future surprise on the scale of Tet by strangling the Viet Cong organization before it could rebuild. By mid-1968, the Phoenix program was fully operational across South Vietnam. Once the Phoenix program was underway, its day-to-day operations unfolded in a tense atmosphere of secrecy and urgency. At the national level, Phoenix was coordinated by a special staff that brought together representatives from the CIA, U.S. Military Assistance Command, MACV, and South Vietnam security forces. But the real work was done out in the provinces and villages. Each of South Vietnam's provinces established a Phen Hoang Committee, a local coordination center, where intelligence was collected, shared, and acted upon. Typically, a U.S. advisor, often a CIA officer or Army intelligence major, sat with the province chief and the local special branch police to review intelligence and prioritize targets. This close integration of military, police, and intelligence resources marked a change from earlier, uncoordinated efforts. Together, they would update blacklists of suspected communists, debate the reliability of informants, and decide which names warranted the next knock on the door or night raid. Information came from many sources: intercepted Viet Cong messages, tips from villagers, names gathered from captured documents, and crucially, the interrogation of prisoners and defectors. Armed with these leads, specialized units would be dispatched to neutralize the identified targets. A typical Phoenix operation might begin with a whisper or a scrap of paper. Perhaps a low-level Viet Cong courier is captured on a jungle trail by South Vietnamese troops. Under questioning, sometimes gentle, often harsh, he reveals the name of the man who secretly commands the local underground network in his home village. That name is passed up the chain and added to a blacklist of high-priority targets. A few weeks later, before dawn, a team of Provincial Reconnaissance Unit, PRU, commandos, elite South Vietnamese troops originally formed by the CIA as counter-terror teams, accompanied by an American advisor, moves into position around a house in that village where the target is believed to be hiding. If all goes well, they capture the suspect alive, seizing documents and maybe a cache of weapons or radios. The prisoner is hooded, hands bound, and whisked away to the nearest interrogation center. If things do not go as planned, if the suspect flees or pulls a gun, the mission can turn deadly in an instant. In such cases, the commandos have orders to kill. What matters to Phoenix is that the target is neutralized, one way or another. The term neutralize became the program's euphemistic signature. It meant to remove a person from the fight, but not necessarily by killing them. In fact, American officers often stressed a preference to capture the Viet Cong agents alive when possible. A live prisoner could be interrogated for valuable intelligence, even turned into a double agent or persuaded to defect to the government side under a clemency initiative called the Chiu Hoi, or Open Arms Program. Thousands of former Viet Cong did take advantage of Chiu Hoi, laying down their arms in exchange for amnesty and a chance to start anew. Many of these defections were credited to Phoenix operations that made life as a clandestine insurgent increasingly perilous. On paper, a suspect who rallied to the government was as much a success for Phoenix as one who was imprisoned or killed. Still, in the reality of the field, capturing hardcore Viet Cong was dangerous and difficult. Often it was quicker and safer for the units involved to simply eliminate a suspect rather than attempt a risky arrest. As one American advisor later put it bluntly, it sometimes came down to expediency. Dead men don't escape or shoot back. By 1969 and 1970, the Phoenix program was running at full throttle. At its height, more than 700 U.S. advisors, from the CIA, military, and other agencies, were attached to the program, working with thousands of South Vietnamese personnel in every province. Provincial reconnaissance units spread out across the country were conducting thousands of operations. These elite teams, composed mostly of South Vietnamese operatives familiar with the local terrain, often with personal stakes in fighting the Viet Cong, operated with a fair degree of autonomy and under a shroud of secrecy. Dressed in black pajamas or civilian clothes, they didn't always distinguish themselves from the guerrillas they were hunting. They relied on surprise and superior intelligence to hit Viet Cong cadre when least expected, at a secret meeting in a hamlet, in the dead of night, or while a target was traveling quietly down a rural footpath. U.S. Special Forces soldiers and Navy SEALs on temporary assignment also participated in or led some Phoenix missions, particularly when pursuing high-value individuals located deep in enemy-controlled territory. These American commandos brought additional firepower and training, and over time a few developed a fearsome reputation among the Viet Cong for their relentless and lethal effectiveness in tracking key leaders. Parallel to the field operations were the interrogation centers, one in each province, where a steady stream of blindfolded detainees arrived tied up in the back of jeeps or helicopters. In the Spartan, heavily guarded rooms of these facilities, intelligence officers and South Vietnamese police specialists pressed the captives for information. Some interrogations were simple questioning sessions, but others devolved into brutal ordeals. Reports from participants in later investigations revealed that torture was frequently used to extract information. Detainees might be beaten with rubber hoses, shocked with electrical wires attached to sensitive parts of the body, submerged headfirst in barrels of water, or hung by ropes in excruciating stress positions. Psychological torment was common as well. Prisoners were isolated in dark cells, threatened with death, or tricked into believing their comrades had betrayed them. In the worst accounts, there were instances of rape and other atrocious abuses. While not every interrogation resorted to such extremes, the environment surrounding the Phoenix program's pursuit of intelligence was undeniably harsh and coercive. U.S. advisors were generally present in a supervisory or support role, while South Vietnamese personnel carried out most of the interrogations. But Americans on the scene knew what was happening in those rooms. Some justified it as the ugly but necessary side of war, arguing that the intelligence gain could thwart Viet Cong plots and ultimately save innocent lives. Others who witnessed the cruelty were deeply unsettled, questioning what moral lines had been crossed in the name of security. Securing reliable intelligence was always a challenge. Viet Cong agents were trained to resist interrogation, and many villagers were too terrified of Viet Cong retribution to inform on the communists. Phoenix operatives had to get creative. One former advisor recounted a macabre field tactic, taking a local informant from a village, placing a burlap sack over the man's head with holes cut for his eyes, and tightening a communication wire around his neck like a leash. The team would then lead this hooded informant through his own village at gunpoint, whispering for him to indicate, perhaps with a subtle nod, which house belonged to the local Viet Cong cadre. In one such case, after identifying a suspect's home, the Phoenix team returned under cover of darkness. They knocked on the door and, as soon as someone answered, opened fire, killing whoever was inside. The rationale was chillingly simple. If the person answering the door was indeed the Viet Cong target, the mission was a success. If it turned out to be a family member or someone else, in the eyes of these operatives, that unfortunate soul was guilty by association. Such was the brutal logic that governed some Phoenix operations in the field. Not every tactic in Phoenix was violent. Some relied on cunning psychological warfare instead. In one province, for example, American and South Vietnamese officials tried to undermine a local Viet Cong leader's reputation with an unusual gift. They delivered a brand new color television set to his family. In a country where owning a television was a rare luxury, the gift immediately aroused suspicion among the villagers. Why was a supposedly committed communist household receiving such a favor from the Saigon government? The hope was that this gesture would sow doubt within the Viet Cong ranks. Perhaps other insurgents would suspect their comrade of taking bribes or enjoying special treatment from the enemy. This somewhat comical ploy highlighted the breadth of the Phoenix campaign. It wasn't all door-kicking raids and interrogations. Sometimes it was about planting seeds of paranoia to erode the enemy from within. These methods made the Phoenix program intensely effective at sowing terror among the Viet Cong ranks, and, undeniably, among many ordinary civilians as well. For the insurgents, nowhere felt safe. Any meeting might be compromised by a spy. Any knock on the door could herald a deadly visit. The pressure on the Viet Cong organization was immense. Many low-level cadre, knowing they were being hunted, lived in constant fear or went deeper into hiding. Some chose to defect under the Chiu Hoi program rather than await a midnight raid from the PRUs. And over time, Phoenix did succeed in eliminating a very large number of Viet Cong operatives and supporters. By official counts, between 1968 and 1972, the Phoenix program neutralized roughly 81,000 suspected Viet Cong members or collaborators. Of those, about 26,000 were killed according to U.S. and South Vietnamese records. The remaining 55,000 or so were captured or persuaded to defect. Some later observers suggested the true number of killings was higher. For instance, journalist Seymour Hersh cited South Vietnamese sources estimating that around 40,000 targets were killed. These are staggering figures, reflecting a campaign of systematic manhunting unprecedented in modern American military history up to that point. American commanders pointed to these numbers as evidence that Phoenix was crippling the insurgency's nervous system. In areas where Phoenix teams were most active, attacks on government forces dropped and Viet Cong influence seemed to wane. By the early 1970s, U.S. officials were cautiously optimistic that they had finally managed to plug the leaks in South Vietnam security, disrupting the Viet Cong's ability to operate at the village level to such an extent that the insurgency would wither for lack of local support. Indeed, after Tet 1968 and the subsequent Phoenix operations, the communist guerrilla movement in many parts of the South was a shadow of its former self. The war's center of gravity shifted increasingly toward conventional fights against large units of the North Vietnamese army, partly because the Viet Cong insurgency had been so attrited. Some American and South Vietnamese leaders even argued that Phoenix shortened the war or saved lives in the long run by heading off countless Viet Cong attacks that never occurred because their planners were taken off the battlefield first. However, amidst these apparent successes, troubling questions and controversies began to surface. The very tactics that made Phoenix effective in one sense, its secrecy, its ruthlessness, its reliance on often ambiguous intelligence, also made it rife for potential abuse and error. The program operated in the shadows with minimal external oversight, and its targets were identified by a patchwork of informers and data that was not always reliable. The pressure to produce results led to quotas for neutralizations being imposed on each province. Every month, Phoenix centers were expected to report a certain number of VCI members eliminated. Critics argue that these quotas encouraged a deadly numbers game. If genuine Viet Cong suspects were scarce in a given area, there was a temptation to count almost anyone even vaguely suspicious as an enemy agent to meet the target. Some innocent villagers were undoubtedly caught up in sweeps or falsely denounced by personal rivals. In the chaos of war, settling a local feud could be as easy as whispering to a Phoenix officer that one's neighbor was aiding the communists. In some instances, corrupt South Vietnamese officials allegedly used Phoenix to eliminate political or business rivals under the guise of counterinsurgency. For most Americans, the Phoenix program was invisible and unheard of while it was in full swing. It operated under a cloak of classification and euphemism, known to only a relatively small circle of participants and officials. By 1970, stories began trickling back to the United States about the darker side of this secret campaign. A few Americans who had worked as Phoenix advisors or interrogators returned home disillusioned and spoke out about what they had seen. One expose in 1970 uncovered secret South Vietnamese prison cells known as tiger cages, where hundreds of suspects, including those swept up by Phoenix operations, were kept in squalid, coffin-like confines and tortured. Photographs of emaciated prisoners shackled in these tiny cages made world headlines, providing stark evidence of the war's darkest corners and adding fuel to the outrage. Their accounts, along with investigative journalism and leaked internal reports, painted a grim picture: clandestine assassination programs, torture chambers, and a body count of civilian dead that was rising behind the veil of classified operations. Anti-war activists seized on Phoenix as yet another example of the moral quagmire of America's Vietnam involvement. The program that had been virtually unknown to the public suddenly became infamous. In 1971, U.S. congressional hearings brought the Phoenix program into the national spotlight. Witnesses, including former military intelligence personnel, delivered shocking testimony. Perhaps the most damning came from Cape Barton Osborne, a young Army intelligence veteran who had served with Phoenix. He described the program as a sterile, depersonalized murder program, stating that in his experience, no targeted individual ever really survived once Phoenix had them in its sights. Osborne testified that he had seen or been made aware of horrific abuses: prisoners tortured with electrical shocks, thrown into cages to starve to death, even an instance of a prisoner executed by having a wooden dowel driven into his ear. Another witness recounted suspects being thrown from helicopters mid-flight during interrogations, a terror tactic used to scare other detainees into talking, by making them think they could be next to be tossed out of a helicopter. These accounts, though later debated and in some cases refuted, or at least not corroborated fully, undeniably confirmed that Phoenix had operated in a murky realm beyond the usual rules of war. Many Americans were appalled to hear that U.S. personnel were involved, even peripherally, in such activities. High-ranking officials who had overseen Phoenix were called to defend the program. Among them was William Colby, a CIA officer who had managed the pacification efforts, including Phoenix, in Vietnam, and who would later become director of Central Intelligence. Colby, a trim, soft-spoken man, acknowledged that Phoenix was a harsh and unforgiving program, but he steadfastly denied that it was a program of assassination targeting innocents. He argued to Congress that Phoenix was a necessary response to an enemy that itself operated in the shadows and routinely murdered village officials at night. Colby emphasized that the goal was to capture as many key Viet Cong operatives alive as possible, saying, "They were of more value to us alive than dead." He explained that under Phoenix guidelines, a suspected Viet Cong member was supposed to be identified by at least 3 independent sources of intelligence before being targeted, to reduce the chance of mistakes or personal vendettas. And if captured, suspects would face questioning under South Vietnamese law and could be imprisoned for years if found to be enemy agents. On paper, the program was bound by legalities. Colby did concede, however, that in the fog of such a dirty war, violations undoubtedly occurred, and some operatives might have exceeded their orders. He pointed out that communist propaganda was eager to highlight any Phoenix abuses, often exaggerating them, but even so, any real excesses by Phoenix operatives were regrettable and not part of the program's intent. Colby's testimony, earnest as it was, could not fully wash away the disturbing image of Phoenix that had emerged. The congressional hearings and the intense media coverage around them had done lasting damage to the program's reputation. For many back home, Phoenix became symbolic of the hidden, dark underside of the Vietnam War, a stark example of how the war had forced America to compromise its own ideals. Faced with mounting public criticism and the shifting winds of U.S. policy in Vietnam, the Phoenix program was gradually wound down. By 1972, as American troop withdrawals accelerated under the policy of Vietnamization, the CIA officially pulled out of Phoenix management, handing full control over to the South Vietnamese. The program in its American-guided form was essentially terminated, funding was slashed, and U.S. advisors were reassigned. However, Phoenix did not vanish overnight. Under President Thio's direction, South Vietnamese Special Branch Police and regional forces carried on the core of the Phoenix approach, now without American oversight or support. They referred to the continued effort under the codename Plan F6. But by then, the war was shifting to pitched conventional battles against the North's regular army, and whatever successes Plan F6 had in hunting guerrilla cadres were swept aside by the collapse of South Vietnam's defenses in 1975. When Saigon fell in April 1975 and Communist forces claimed victory, those South Vietnamese who had been part of Phoenix or Plan F6 became marked men and women. The new regime viewed them as collaborators in a brutal campaign against the revolution. Many were sent to grim re-education camps for long imprisonment. Some simply disappeared. Phoenix had cut deep wounds, and the victors exacted their revenge accordingly. Today, decades later, the Phoenix program remains one of the most debated and unsettling chapters of the Vietnam War. Its legacy is a complex one. On one hand, there is evidence that it dealt serious blows to the Viet Cong's ability to wage insurgency. U.S. military records and even some statements from former Viet Cong and North Vietnamese officials suggest that from 1969 onward, the communist underground in many areas was under severe strain. In fact, several North Vietnamese leaders later acknowledged the damage. North Vietnamese General Truran De, a deputy commander in the South, was quoted as saying that the Phoenix program was extremely effective in crippling the revolution at the village level. William Colby and others have noted that, in their view, the Phoenix program was the single most effective counterinsurgency tool used in Vietnam, claiming it essentially cut the heart out of the insurgency by destroying the Viet Cong's political cadres. In support of this perspective, it's pointed out that after 1968, the insurgency in many regions struggled to regain its former strength. Indeed, the Tet Offensive that so startled the world also devastated the Viet Cong's ranks, and Phoenix hammered the survivors and their support networks in the following years. By the early 1970s, the nature of the conflict had indeed shifted more toward open warfare against Northern Army units, in part because the Southern guerrilla apparatus had been so aggressively pruned. Some American officials argue that Phoenix likely saved lives in the long term, by preventing untold Viet Cong bombings, assassinations, and attacks on civilians that never happened because their perpetrators were identified and captured beforehand. Yet on the other hand, the moral and strategic costs of the Phoenix program are impossible to ignore. Thousands of civilians were caught in the crossfire of this shadow war. Many were killed on the basis of flimsy evidence or mistaken identity. For many ordinary South Vietnamese, this period became one of unbearable tension. A peasant in a contested hamlet might one day be coerced by Viet Cong guerrillas into giving them a meal or hiding a sack of rice, and the next day find himself accused by government operatives of aiding the insurgents. A village schoolteacher might be quietly loyal to Saigon, but still end up on a Phoenix blacklist because a jealous neighbor whispered false rumors. Countless families felt they were living between hammer and anvil, threatened by the Viet Cong if they showed any support for the government, yet under suspicion by the government if they even passively accommodated or failed to resist the Viet Cong. The result was a climate of fear that blanketed much of the countryside. People went to sleep not knowing if a late-night knock on the door would mean recruitment by the guerrillas or a raid by a Phoenix team. In such an atmosphere, trust eroded, and the line between friend and foe blurred for many civilians caught in the middle. The use of torture and assassination as routine tools of policy exacted a heavy toll not just on the victims but on the morality and integrity of those carrying out the program. News of Phoenix's excesses, once revealed, fueled anti-war sentiment back in the United States and soured many on the notion that America's involvement in Vietnam was in any way noble or defensible. The scandal also contributed to a post-war wave of introspection. In 1975, a series of congressional investigations into intelligence activities, spurred in part by revelations like those of the Phoenix program, led to greater oversight and reforms in how America conducted covert operations. Internationally, Phoenix fed into a propaganda narrative that depicted the Saigon government and its American backers as brutal oppressors willing to kill and torture the very people they claimed to be protecting. It undermined the goal of winning hearts and minds whenever stories spread of a family wiped out in a Phoenix raid or a neighbor dragged off to a secret prison. Some analysts argue that any short-term gains in security were undermined by the long-term alienation and resentment such tactics bred among the populace. In this view, the Phoenix program, by betraying the moral high ground, ultimately did more political harm than military good to the American South Vietnamese cause. In American military and intelligence circles, the legacy of Phoenix has served both as a cautionary tale and, perhaps, as a source of lessons for future conflicts. During later wars, such as the counterinsurgency campaigns in Iraq and Afghanistan, U.S. strategists studied the Phoenix program while developing operations to target insurgent networks. The idea of using precise intelligence to capture or eliminate insurgent leaders is now standard in counterinsurgency and counterterrorism. Consider modern-day special operations raids or drone strikes aimed at terrorist commanders. In this sense, Phoenix was a forerunner of tactics that, decades later, would be employed against groups like Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. Furthermore, the influence of Phoenix did not end with Vietnam. Some of the counterinsurgency and intelligence officers who cut their teeth in Vietnam later applied similar methods in other conflicts. During the Cold War, U.S. advisors in countries such as El Salvador and Guatemala shared lessons reminiscent of Phoenix with local forces battling guerrillas. Even if not officially replicated, the ethos of targeting insurgent infrastructure seeped into these struggles. However, the shadow side of Phoenix, its propensity for abuse and the difficulty of maintaining ethical control over such a secretive campaign, casts a long shadow. Modern programs strive to avoid the errors of Phoenix by imposing stricter oversight, clearer rules of engagement, and more transparency when carrying out this kind of work. Ultimately, the Phoenix program stands as one of the most paradoxical episodes of the Vietnam War. It was at once a product of desperation and innovation, a brutally pragmatic solution to a vexing problem that conventional military force alone could not solve. It inflicted serious damage on the Viet Cong's underground apparatus, arguably shortening the lifespan of the insurgency in many areas. And yet, it also encapsulated the war's tragic moral compromises. The more the counterinsurgents tried to stamp out the rebellion by descending into the shadows and using the enemy's own ruthless methods, the more they risked losing the very principles they were supposedly fighting for. The story of Phoenix is not one of clear-cut victory or defeat, but rather a grim lesson in the ambiguities of modern warfare. It forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about means and ends. Can a counterinsurgency campaign rooted in fear and coercion ever truly win the allegiance of a population? Does the end of eliminating a dangerous enemy justify the means of terrorizing and brutalizing a countryside? The answers are not easy, and they remain as relevant as ever in debates over how to combat insurgencies and terrorism. As an episode in the Vietnam War, the Phoenix program is a reminder of just how far into the shadows that conflict went. It is a story of spies and assassins operating in hamlets and back alleys, of villages where the night brought dread, of moral lines blurred by the fog of an unconventional war. For some, Phoenix was a bold and necessary strategy that finally put a stranglehold on a dangerous insurgency. For others, it was an unforgivable descent into extrajudicial killing that stained America's honor and undermined the cause it was meant to serve. Over 50 years later, the specter of the Phoenix program continues to loom in discussions of counterinsurgency, both as a model to consider and a cautionary tale to heed. In the final calculation, it stands as a sobering chapter in an already sobering war, an emblem of the lengths nations will go when fighting in the shadows, and the lasting price that can come with such choices. Even in today's conflicts, when armies and agencies hunt elusive insurgents or terrorists, the specter of Phoenix hovers in the background, reminding us of the fine line between effective security and the abyss of atrocity. The Phoenix program is history now, but its legacy lives on as both a warning and a lesson for future generations who grapple with the unforgiving dilemmas of war without front lines.